Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 416th episode, it's our first episode back from SVP. So we have a ton of dinosaur talks hot off the presses to talk about.
Yep, and we are currently recording in the dark because we're still on the road, and in the dark is how you don't get a random ringing sound from the lights in this room.
Yep. That's a pro tip, is a lot of times dimmers cause ringing on microphones. So even at full blast, it was still ringing, so we turned off the lights.
That's how committed we are.
We're illuminated by our laptop glows. So
all right, getting into it.
In this episode, we have all that news from SVP. We also have an interview with a best-selling author, New York Times bestseller, also famous for his work as a Jurassic World consultant, and that is Steve Brusatte.
Yes, known among many things for his book, The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, and also The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. And of course, we have our dinosaur of the day, which in this episode is Bruhathkayosaurus.
And I also have a fun fact from SVP as well. But before we get into all of that, first I want to thank some of our patrons, and this week I'd like to thank Brad Shelby, who recently rejoined, a shout out here. So thank you very much for re-upping your pledge. We also have Oscar, Misunderstood Oviraptor, Jonah, Robert, Amato Titan, Christine, Wyatt, Kentrosaurus, and Ashley the Acrocanthosaurus.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a fellow Dino-it-all and joining our community. Again, your support is why we can keep doing the show and covering things like SVP. So as always, we will be covering all the amazing things we learned from SVP over a series of episodes because it's way too much to talk about in one episode.
Yeah, it took several days to learn all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, like 3 to 6, maybe 9 hours a day. So yeah, we can't fit it in.
Right.
Well, 1 hour episode. So kicking it off, we've got the technical session about dinosaurs, which is always a great place to be.
You could say that about any of the dinosaur sessions. You could say that about any of the sessions at SVP.
Mm-hmm. So our first talk was by Rauhoot, and they were talking about a whole series of dinosaurs from the Cañadón Calcareo Formation in Chubut, Argentina. Today, back then, it was in the Jurassic of Gondwana. And they just have a ton of dinosaurs from this area, as is often the case from Patagonia.
Mm-hmm.
They've got a few large theropods. Probably one of them, at least, is an abelosaurid. They have a partial stegosaur humerus, which is actually really significant because we don't have a whole lot of stegosaurs from down there. They also have some ceratosaurs and a whole bunch of coelurosaurs.
Ooh.
That area also has the Pandoravinator holotype, which might turn out to be kind of important because it's like an early branch on the Tetanuran clade, which is the stiff tail group. They also have some noasaurids like Elaphrosaurus and a whole bunch of sauropods. One of them might be new, but there's also Tendaguria, Wamwaracadia, and maybe something like a Giraffatitan. And then there's also something that new one might be a Titanosaur. So a whole bunch of cool stuff that's going to be coming out of Patagonia in the coming months to years.
We'll definitely be keeping a lookout.
The next talk we saw was by Victoria Arbor, and it was funny because she said it's basically a talk of what I did on my summer vacation, which was, you may remember, she moved over to the Victoria Museum, way in like the farthest west you can get in Canada. And there aren't a ton of dinosaurs that we talk about from over there. We're usually talking about Alberta, mostly, occasionally Saskatchewan. But yeah, not much from British Columbia usually. But apparently there are quite a few areas in British Columbia that could have fossils. There just aren't a lot of people looking for them.
But now we've got Victoria.
Exactly. So she's out there digging around for dinosaurs, or really hunting on the surface mostly, as you do. The area she was mostly talking about is not really precisely dated. I guess the whole region is known to be between 56 and 130 million years ago, which is very broad. That's like almost 80 million years of time.
That could be a lot of dinosaurs in there.
Yes. Their best guess is it's from the Maastrichtian and probably maybe the last 2 million years based on the kinds of things that they've found. But they want to really find some pollen. That's a really good way to date more precisely because a lot of plants evolve more quickly and pollen tends to fossilize fairly well. So hopefully they'll be able to do that and get a more specific date on it.
Mm-hmm.
But that formation in one area where it outcrops is where they found Ferrosaurus, which was named back in 2019. And they think it was exploded out of the rock during construction because there's a railroad line that was going through there. But it's actually been abandoned for quite a while, for about 50 years. So it's completely covered in plant growth. And they went back there, but they couldn't find any more. There was just too many plants and too much stuff in the way.
Oh.
And perhaps too much dirt and, all those tricky things that get in the way of finding fossils.
Might have been eroded a little bit too.
Yeah, if there had been anything on the surface, that's true because it gets pretty icy up there. And then after that, what they did is they switched to a new location, which is called the Spatsizi Plateau, and they found a quote-unquote weird-looking pebble, or at least one of the people in the area did, and that turned out to be a serrated dinosaur tooth.
Nice.
The park is only accessible by helicopter, so it's really expensive and difficult to get to it, but the picture of this place was insane. It literally looked like a field as far as the eye could see of boulders like broken into jagged pieces. And she's just standing in the middle of this massive area of just like really sharp rocks all around her. And then there were some pictures of those rocks and there are just dinosaur bones right on that flat surface where it's broken. So it appears that there are a lot of dinosaurs there. They said basically every time they go there, they find a whole bunch of dinosaurs pretty easily. But unfortunately, a lot of them aren't in very good shape. So they're on those surfaces of rocks that are sort of split open. And the way Victoria put it was they were probably in really good shape about 1,000 years ago when the glaciers left.
Oh,
yeah. They've basically been exposed for a really long time. And they're very hard. So they're pretty hardy and they're still like there.
We're 1,000 years too late.
Yeah, exactly. For some of them, at least. I'm sure inside some of those rocks, once you get past that first little bit of fossil that's sticking out, there might be some better stuff deeper into the rock, but they haven't gotten a chance to find too much yet. What they have to do is saw the rock out of it. They bought a rock saw just for this because it's very hard rock, then put it in their backpacks and then get on the helicopter. So you obviously can't take huge chunks with you and then like go back to a lab and carefully prep it out or scan it and see what's in it or anything like that.
Sounds like a real adventure.
It is. And it is very difficult for weather too, because they said in 2019 when they got there, on August 18th, they got snowed in by a blizzard.
Oh my goodness.
Which basically put an end to their expedition.
Yep, that'll do it.
And then in 2020, they couldn't go because of COVID. And then in 2021, they found bones right away, including an ornithischian ischium, which they managed to bring back, and quite a few other bones. But again, there was another day where they got snowed in, and I think that time it was in July or something. So it's very far north in British Columbia. It's a tricky place with a very narrow window when the area isn't covered in snow and ice that you can actually get some work done. So it's going to take a lot of years to get through all this area. But they do have a little bit of mapping to work with. Apparently, it's been mapped out okay by some oil exploration, but they're obviously not there looking for any sort of dinosaur stuff. So yeah, we're not sure exactly yet. So far, they think what they have, their best guess is that they have lots of pretty good looking ribs, maybe a hadrosaur tibia, a possible scapula coracoid, which is like the shoulder blade, and maybe some type of skull that's still pretty embedded in the rock. So that would be really cool. And then she mentioned there's also a ton of turtles because there seems to be turtles everywhere all the time.
Yes, and not just with the sauropods, Garrett.
The most exciting thing, though, is that they might have an ankylosaur rib,
Ooh.
or at least she said she wants to believe it's an ankylosaur rib.
Yeah.
But she's an ankylosaur person, so there might be a little motivated reasoning going on there.
But that doesn't mean it's not.
Yes, that's true. It could be. Then we heard from Avrahami talking about a new species of orodromine from the Mustn't Touch It.
I like that name. Mustn't touch it.
It is great. So orodromines are mostly in North America. There's about 1 to 3 in Korea and Northeast China, and then also Mongolia. But they found a bunch of these in the highest Mustn't Touch It. Sedimentologically, it's mostly mudstone, probably from a river delta.
Just a quick reminder, Mustn't Touch, it's in Utah in the US.
Yeah, I should have specified that.
Got too caught up having fun saying the name.
Yeah. So this block that they found one block that includes a juvenile, a neonatal, so even younger, and then about 4 to 5 year olds, like 4 to 5 year olds, maybe 2 of them or so. But it's hard to tell because it's reconstructed using like the best techniques they can to put them together. But it's hard to know, how many there are when they're all jumbled up together. They're saying it's similar to Arictodromeus with one sacral vertebrae that's so pneumatic it's basically hollow.
Oh, weird.
So both sides of the vertebrae have openings that reach the middle. It literally looks like someone like drilled a hole like through the hole, but like a really large hole. Like you could just reach through it. It's crazy how hollow that bone looks. And they have seen that sort of thing on a couple of individuals before. And yeah, so someone asked how it's not a pathology, because sometimes huge holes grow in bones. And they said that they didn't see any signs, but it is possible. But given how symmetric it is and the fact that it's been in similar other dinosaurs, not quite that extreme, but it looks a lot like an Arictodromeus in general when you look at all the bones, that it might be another similar. I mean, it's an orodromine, and those are closely related to Arictodromeus, so it makes sense. But it sounds like a really cool fossil.
It does.
Then we had Susie Maidment, who we just talked to on the podcast not too long ago about stegosaurs. This time she was mostly talking about Iguanodon and its closest relatives, but still from the UK. So basically the early Cretaceous in southern England and the Isle of Wight. And essentially what she was saying is that Iguanodon was a little bit of a wastebasket taxon. There were all sorts of different Iguanodon species.
Yep.
One of them got renamed Hypselospinus. There was also Beryllium. And then there have been a whole ton of different species. And the interesting thing was she said the genus Iguanodon, quote, spans 40 million years or something stupid like that. Quote.
Yeah, usually we talk about species being, 2 million years?
Yeah, so this is a genus, which is one level up from a species. But yeah, you don't usually have a genus that lasts that long. I mean, that's practically like from now almost all the way back to when dinosaurs were around. Like we don't have
almost, yeah,
any genera really that last that long. That's a really long time. So what she did was she reviewed the former Iguanodons, and they think that about 5 of them are valid from the lower Wealden, which is a time range of about 12 million years. So even though it says just the lower part of a formation having 5 very closely related species seems like a lot, over 12 million years, like you were saying, a lot of them last about 2 million years. So that's pretty reasonable.
Pretty good. And it's the 12 million year period that's about 142 to 130 million years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And they also said that the basic rule of thumb people were doing for a long time was in that area, if they found a small iguanodont, they called it Mantellosaurus. And if they found a large iguanodont, they would call it Iguanodon. So
that's why it was so important when she and the team scanned Mantellosaurus.
Exactly.
And they're working on a monograph of it.
Yeah, because then you can see some of the unique characters of it other than just the size. But since there are now like about 5 taxa from that one, it's obviously a lot more than just Mantellosaurus and Iguanodon. So they ended up redefining almost all the material they have from the area as indeterminate because, it's just these small bones that don't have a lot of diagnostic features, except for the holotypes. Those are clearly, have to be diagnostic. But they do think there is a new taxon that lived around the same time as Polacanthus, and that's going to get named soon.
Yeah, and it was a specimen that was in private collections until the last year or so, and the Isle of Wight Museum got it.
Nice, yeah.
So the gist is that there's a lot of diversity in the Wealden supergroup.
And there's going to be a lot of iguanodonts, or iguanodontids, or iguanodontians.
I wrote down a quote from her. She said, taxonomy is a hypothesis, which is good to keep in mind. I mean, we see it all the time. Things are always changing. One person asked how you could tell the differences in specimens and species. And she said it was a good question. It was a valid question. But if we knew that, that would, quote, solve paleontology.
Yeah, because the difference between a genus and a species and a family and all those things are very fuzzy. And it basically just boils down to being consistent within the groups, because that way we're all sort of playing by the same rules and it's easier to decide on when something should get lumped or split.
Yes.
The next talk was the first one in the session about sauropods.
Which I wrote down a quote here too. Quote, first talk on the best group.
Yeah. At least according to Kimmy Chappelle, who was talking about it.
She wasn't the only one in the room who thought so.
I didn't hear like a round of applause from that comment.
We were all so busy taking it in.
Oh, I see. Maybe I should say sauropodomorphs, because I think this is an earlier one. They were looking at sauropodomorph eggs and embryos from some early dinosaurs. So they talked about Lufungosaurus, Massospondylus, and Moosaurus. And they've looked at Massospondylus before. And basically, we've talked about how they developed and maybe they started out as quadrupedal and then became bipedal and all that jazz.
Mm-hmm.
But they found that they were about 60% through their development in the eggs that they were looking at in this case. So not really that close to hatching. If 60%, that's like just a little over halfway through their gestation in these eggs.
True.
Based on these eggs and other similar finds, they hypothesized that Moosaurus is a colonial nester with age-segregated herds, meaning that as they start to hatch, they sort of divide up into their little age groups and then stick together in those groups. And they've previously found that they had softer, more leathery eggshells, which obviously makes it a lot harder to find them in the fossil record.
Oh, yeah.
But they have a couple of eggs that they showed some details of, and they're pretty disarticulated. They don't know why they're so disarticulated, because usually when something fossilizes in an egg, it's preserved, like it's in its little case.
Yeah.
It's like finding that, that rare toy that's never been opened in its box. It should be in really good shape. It shouldn't be all like broken into pieces.
Just you've got that preserved moment in time.
Yeah, exactly. The way she was talking about these dinosaur eggs, though, she said it looks like someone shook it around, which I guess is possible. But like, I don't know, something weird happened to these eggs because they looked like just a whole bunch of broken pieces all switched around, and it makes it really difficult to reconstruct.
Yes.
But fortunately with CT scanning, you can look inside the egg, find all the little pieces, at least those that have ossified, because since they were only 60% through their development, it wasn't all, not all the bone is there. Some of it was still forming.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully they'll be able to piece this together and see if it is in fact a Moosaurus or one of these other dinosaurs, and then maybe even name a new dinosaur depending on what it is. And we might learn some new things about these very early, still in eggs dinosaurs.
Yay, sauropods and sauropodomorphs.
Yeah, there were quite a few sauropod talks. So tell me more about sauropods.
Well, the next one was by Linnea Jackson about Jolly Roger. That's the nickname of this dinosaur. I don't think she said how that nickname came to be.
No, I don't think so either. We should have asked that during the Q&A section.
Yeah.
Why is it Jolly Roger?
So they found Jolly Roger on Mount Kirkpatrick of the Hansen Formation at the bottom of a boulder in Antarctica.
Yes, which is the same place as Glacialosaurus and some other dinosaurs. It's one of the two spots basically in Antarctica where they find most of them, the other being James Ross Island.
Yes.
But this is the more remote, like deep into Antarctica, way up a mountain, not an easy place to do excavations spot.
Exactly. I always am impressed when I hear about finds from Antarctica.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So this one, they've got cranial remains, the skull. It's a basal sauropodomorph. Even though it's from the same formation as Glacialosaurus, we only have the postcranial remains, the body. For the Jolly Roger, they've got the skull, which is about the size of a hand, so not very big.
But it is really nice looking.
Yeah. They do have bones from the body, too. She made sure to know that we knew they exist. And they were used when it came to kind of looking at Jolly Roger to definitively say that it's different from Glacialosaurus. But mostly we were focused on the skull here.
Yeah, it is nice, though, because there were the unique things about Glacialosaurus, and we found enough of Jolly Roger to compare it, so we can say they're different animals.
Oh, they did do histology. They found Jolly Roger to be at most 1 to 2 years old.
Makes sense that the skull is the large piece of the maxilla they have is only about the size of a hand.
Mm-hmm. The skull is a little bit distorted and crushed, but you can still learn a lot. The teeth are unserrated. They have an indent on the backside, which is similar to the teeth of Camarasaurus.
Mm-hmm.
And Camarasaurus, it's interesting because Camarasaurus came much later and was much more derived. Now, at the time that Jolly Roger was alive, Antarctica was mostly still in contact with South America. So it wasn't nearly as remote or difficult to get to.
You're right. Probably not even on a mountain back then. Yeah, they also shared a little bit of their analysis, and they showed that the population of these sauropodomorphs started in South America, moved to Europe, and then to Africa, and then later into Antarctica, both for Glacialosaurus and Jolly Roger. But even though they both came from South Africa, or Southern Africa, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
they seem to have come from different ancestors. So they were in different groups, which means there's probably a huge number more of sauropods to fill in these pieces.
Yes.
Before we know the whole story of how these dinosaurs were moving around between Africa and Antarctica.
So much movement.
Yeah.
The next talk was by Tess Gallagher, and it was about the Mother's Day quarry in southern Montana, which mostly has juvenile Diplodocus, so more sauropods. It's most likely that they lived in a herd together. They would have been in a harsh climate with dry and wet seasons. And in a dry season, maybe they were looking for a water source and died of dehydration. Then rains came and swept the bodies away, tore them apart, and left them where we see them today. So not the most fun story for a place called Mother's Day Quarry.
Yeah, it's because they found it on Mother's Day.
Yeah. Now, the Diplodocus, they had different shapes and patterns in the skin, and one patch had 6 types of scales, which they said were very textured in life. They had to leave the skin out in the field in 2020 for about a year, and the glue that they used when they were working on it before they left it out in the field, it cracked the skin and made it pretty fragile, unfortunately, but you can still learn a lot from them. So the scales are about 3 millimeters wide, and they're polygonal.
Some of the scales. That's one of the 6 types.
Oh, yes. They said all the specimens, all the scales, they had to view them upside down in a light microscope because there was too much glue and sediment to look at it right side up. And they CT scanned one of the scales. The specimens had these black dots on them, which were interesting. And she talked about how big animals, and we've talked about this on the show, they have a hard time staying cool because they've got this proportionally low surface area. So even a 3-ton Edmontosaurus would have had trouble staying cool. And then, of course, sauropods are much bigger. So what did they do? Well, they increased their surface area. And one way to do this is with porous media, which apparently greatly increases your surface area. It's commonly used for heat transfer in modern day appliances.
Yeah, so she described it as a metal heat sink, basically, which is just a really porous metal. Well, I mean, they don't have to be porous. You can also do it with a whole bunch of skinny fins, like a radiator in a car,
Mm-hmm.
but you can also do it in an organic system. They tend to be more porous and like sort of spongy looking.
Yeah, as an example, she mentioned carbon nanofoam. The pores are tiny, so that actually has a surface area even bigger than Diplodocus. And if you have carbon nanofoam that's the size of a penny, it's going to have a surface area the size of a football field.
Yeah, I actually, back in college, I worked in a lab briefly that was synthesizing these, they call them nanoporous carbons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we would say is like a gram of it had the surface area of like a tennis court. It's just crazy the amount of surface area these things have.
Yeah.
And it can be really useful for things, and heat transfer is one of them. Although I will say on that nano scale,
Mm-hmm.
getting air in and out of it can be tricky. Like the fluid mechanics of that doesn't necessarily work super great depending on which way the pores are going and how well they connect up in, different ways like that. So it wouldn't be the same as having, just a back that's the size of a football field.
Right.
It's not going to be quite that good, but it's definitely better than just having perfectly smooth skin or just regular scales.
Yeah. So yeah, for Diplodocus, the porous scales could potentially increase its surface area, help it with cooling down. And, maybe they wallowed in water or mud because the sponge-like structure, it would absorb the water or mud into the scales, and then throughout the day, that evaporates and cools the body down, kind of like artificial sweat.
Yeah. And they also mentioned it could be like a thorny devil that absorbs waters into its skin and uses it later for drinking, although they don't think that's the most likely thing that sauropods might be doing with it.
So what's cool is they found more Diplodocus skin this past summer, and they'll have more to look at.
Yep. And I don't think you mentioned it, but those black dots, I think, were what they were calling papillae, which are like these little bumps that are known to be potentially on sauropod skin.
Yes. The next talk was by Moore, and it was a reevaluation of Mamenchisaurus Sinocanidorum.
Yeah, we love Mamenchisaurus with its crazy neck.
Oh, yeah. So they re-examined it to kind of flesh out its description. They found it to be no older than 162.4 million years old. And they said the original diagnosis was no longer adequate, but Mamenchisaurus Sinocanidorum does have at least 6 unique features. And these are details like pneumaticity, or holes in various parts like the axis, bifurcation in one of the ribs, things like that. And then, of course, being a Mamenchisaurus, as Garrett said, we love them because of their long necks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the extremely long vertebrae, and quite a few vertebrae, both.
Yeah. They were estimating that its neck was about 15 meters long, which is one of the longest necks of any sauropod.
Yeah, they said 14.4 meters to 15.1 meters, which is approaching 50 feet long.
Yeah.
I think somebody in our Discord was saying like its neck is longer than like some sauropods and most dinosaurs.
Yes. How did it possibly hold it up? I don't know.
It's amazing. I love that crazy neck.
Me too.
They also said that it's likely the longest neck of any sauropod, but there is a specimen of Diplodocus that has an especially long neck. So that could be a contender as well. So yeah, it's crazy.
Yes. Cool. Yeah, it ended up being kind of a sauropod heavy day.
It was, yeah. There are a lot of other dinosaur talks that we will be talking about in the next few days, and also in bonus content.
Oh, yeah. Well, plus the non-dinosaur bonus content.
Yes.
So much good stuff.
And shortly, we're going to go on to our interview with Steve Brusatte, but real quick, we're going to pause for a sponsor break. And without further ado, we're going to get on to our interview with Steve Brusatte. But as always, we got talking about a lot of paleontology, and it was too much to fit into the episode. But if you want to hear a ton of other connections between mammals and dinosaurs, and just how mammals evolved into the amazing creatures that we are today, if I say so myself, then be sure to check out our extended interview that's available to all of our patrons on patreon.com/iknowdino.
We're here today actually at SVP with Steve Brusatte, who is a paleontologist and, of course, the paleontology advisor for Jurassic World, but also the author of The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs and The Rise and Reign of Mammals, which is what we're here to talk about today. Thanks for chatting with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great to see you guys again. That it's really a wonderful thing to be back at a Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting. You know, the first one in person. Well, for me, in 4 years, because our son was born in 2019, so I couldn't go. And then this pandemic happened. A few years of no in-person meetings. So it's great to be here 4 years later and just seeing old friends and meeting a lot of new people, seeing a lot of students and seeing a lot of my students and my postdocs presenting their research, and particularly the research they've been working on during those darkest, times of the pandemic. So it's been really fun these last few days.
Good. I mean, you were very busy yourself during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, mostly, raising an infant and then a toddler and so on. And then it's like, wow, we're
doing research, writing a book, advising.
Yeah, all those things. And it was, I mean, obviously the pandemic's, been awful in so many ways, but, the last couple of years have been busy from a work side and family side and doing all this stuff, mostly remotely and at home, but, teaching and rearranging research and supervising the students. And then doing, things like writing the mammal book and working on Jurassic World and so on, while having the little guy running around the house. So it's been an adventure. It's been a lot of fun. I tell you, because having opportunities to do things like write pop science books or consult on a blockbuster film. These are unusual things. I'm very fortunate that these opportunities have arisen, and I just love doing them. I love taking the chances when they come, and I hope through the book and through the film that we've been able to communicate some cool science to a pretty big audience, mostly through the film, of course.
Sure. Yeah, it's hard to beat that audience size.
Yes, I don't know how many tens, hundreds of millions, I don't know, people around the world saw the film. And that's the wonderful thing, because there's probably no medium of communication that can reach more people around the world than a blockbuster film. So just the opportunity to have new dinosaurs in the film, to finally get some feathers on the dinosaurs in the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World franchise. It wasn't, well, I certainly helped, but it wasn't my idea. I think every paleontologist for years has been saying, put feathers on the dinosaurs. It's kind of a low-hanging fruit of an idea, because we all know they had feathers. But no, from the moment I met Colin Trevorrow, the director, he said, I want a bunch of new dinosaurs. I want to put feathers on some of the dinosaurs this time. I want to do it right. Can you help me do it? And so that's why I knew just instantaneously after meeting Colin that he was serious and that it would be a lot of fun to work on the film. And he really delivered, him and the artists. Of course, these are movie dinosaurs, monster movie characters, but there is a lot of great new science in them. And I think people around the world seeing feathers on those dinosaurs, I just can't imagine how many millions of people have seen feathers on a dinosaur for the first time.
Yeah.
And then just, and make them think, well, what is that? Hopefully it'll lead some people to do a bit of research, go online, learn about new discoveries, maybe even pick up a dinosaur book to learn more.
Yeah. And then a mammal book after that.
And then a mammal book. So The Rise and Reign of the Mammals came out in the summer of 2022, right around the time of Jurassic World. I have a very savvy editor who knows the best time to release books. But it's a pop science book, for adults, but I think accessible, certainly for teenagers and maybe some younger readers, that tells the story of mammal evolution of 325 million years from the time the mammal lineage split from the reptiles all the way up through the time of dinosaurs, mammals living in the shadows, biding their time, the asteroid, the opportunity, mammals flourish and diversify, leading up to today, 6,000 species, bats and whales and elephants and rats and humans and so on.
So much diversity.
It is. And it was a lot of fun writing it, because it is a follow-up to the rise and fall of the dinosaurs in some ways. It's written in a similar style, but it's very much our story. It's the deep story of us, because we are a mammal, and why we act the way the way we act, look the way we look, is all because of our mammalness, of these things that we've evolved, that we've inherited from our distant mammal ancestors. So I like to think of the book as just a really long-term, deep time history of us. Yeah. And that made it fun to write. And I also, of course, learned a ton writing it, just because I've mostly studied dinosaurs during my career as a scientist. And so writing the dinosaur book was something that I could do really based on a lot of experience in research and doing fieldwork and discovering and describing dinosaurs and studying their evolution. I've done less work on mammals, although I'm doing more and more as a scientist, and my students really are doing great work on mammals. But I needed to learn a lot, which was a lot of fun, just going through all the literature on, everything from, the origin of mammals way back in the Triassic, these things with tiny little teeth, found in caves in, Britain, all the way up to, the biggest things that have ever lived, whales, and how they evolved. So I learned a lot of fun, and I hope my enthusiasm for learning about these mammals comes across.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. And you've got there's still, just like with the rise and fall of dinosaurs, there's personal stories, there's the different research, there's all this history, the history of the field itself and what we're learning and everything. And there was a lot of dinosaurs too in the book.
Yes, of course, because, well, first of all, I'll always love dinosaurs. I'll always find a way to sneak in some dinosaur content, whatever I'm doing. But because the dinosaur story and the mammal story are intertwined stories, I think there is a bit of a misconception. You see it sometimes in children's books and television shows, sometimes even in museum exhibits, this idea that the dinosaurs had their day, they were dominant for tens of millions of years, the asteroid came, wiped them out, then mammals evolved to take their place. Now, certainly mammals did replace dinosaurs as, the preeminent vertebrates on land, in terms of a group of great diversity ranging in size and diet and behavior. They did replace the dinosaurs in that sense, but they didn't evolve to do it. They survived. Mammals survived the asteroid because mammals were already there. And in fact, mammals and dinosaurs go back to the same time and place. They have the same origin story. They go back to the Triassic period, the supercontinent of Pangaea, 230-ish million years ago. They both went off on their own. Dinosaurs were destined for grandeur. Some of them became the size of Boeing 737 airplanes, and
So in a way, mammals got there too.
Yeah, and then later, of course, mammals did the dinosaurs even better in terms of whales. But dinosaurs, they got really, really big, and they filled the large-bodied roles and some smaller bodied roles in a lot of ecosystems on land. The mammals went small. They really were living in the shadows. They were B-list, C-list characters in a dinosaur drama. And the dinosaurs kept the mammals small. There wasn't space, for mammals to become big because the dinosaurs were there. They were the incumbents. And so what that meant was mammals had to be resilient. They had to be adaptable. And living underfoot, underground, in this dinosaur world, mammals diversified. Now, they never got bigger than a badger or a house cat during the entire 150 million years or so that mammals lived with dinosaurs, but they became exceptionally adaptable and diverse. And some of them were scurriers, some were diggers, some were climbers, some were swimmers, some were gliders that floated between the trees on wings of skin. It's just that they were small, but they were so good at being small that they did the opposite to the dinosaurs. So dinosaurs kept mammals small, and mammals kept dinosaurs big. You never saw, a T-Rex the size of a mouse or a Triceratops the size of a rat, because mammals were the champions in those underground, underfoot, hidden, shadow, underworld niches. And then the asteroid hit, and that just instantaneously, changed the rules of the game. The dinosaurs, except for some birds, didn't survive. A lot of mammals died too, but some mammals survived because they were small, because they could eat a lot of food, different types of food, because they could grow fast, reproduce fast, because they had been fine-tuned, honed to be resilient during the time, all that time living underfoot of the dinosaurs. And then now, imagine our furry little ancestor, little thing the size of a shrew or a mouse, which is true. Realize we had an ancestor that stared down that asteroid. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And imagine you're that little ancestor. You've survived. You poke your head out of your burrow. The world's on fire, but there's no T-Rexes anymore. There's no Triceratopses anymore. That's a world of abundant opportunity, and mammals seize that opportunity. And then for the last 66 million years, mammals have been getting bigger and spreading around the world and diversifying into all sorts of species, 6,000 or so of which live today, including us.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not as many as birds right now, though. So
That is
dinosaurs
true.
still beating us out in
You're
count.
absolutely right. There's, around 14,000 species of birds and 6,000 species of mammals. So in a sense, dinosaurs are still more than twice as good as mammals, if you go by overall diversity. And that's important. It is a reminder that, when we talk about dinosaurs being dominant or whatever, it is a little glib. We're using these informal terms, and in the way of overall, number of species, there are still lots of dinosaurs, but mammals are the champions in terms of just the sheer range of size, from tiny little bats the size of and shrews, not much bigger than bumblebees, all the way up to blue whales, the biggest things that have ever lived in the history of the world, and just all the environments mammals live in, whether it's ones living on the land and fast runners on the land, burrowers, things that live in the trees, things that fly in terms of bats, things that live in the water and can't even come back onto the land like whales. That's something, by the way, dinosaurs never did. There were never any fully aquatic, completely ocean living dinosaurs. There were things like Spinosaurus, that were probably semi-aquatic and lived, kind of at that interface of water and land, but there were no dinosaurs that did the whale thing. So, that's just one example of how mammals have not only, taken over from the dinosaurs as those very diverse animals that are the preeminent ones in ecosystems around the world, but they've done things that even dinosaurs couldn't do.
Yeah.
I liked you have these stories about actual paleontologists going out there. And one of them that really stood out to me is Sophia, I might need some help pronouncing her name, Kilan-Jaworowska.
Well, I'm not a native Polish speaker, so my pronunciation will probably be off too. But Zofia Kilan-Jaworowska, one of my heroes, and I talk about her in the book. So I do, the book is a story of mammal evolution, 325 million year narrative, but I intersperse stories of, my own work, the works of my students, my colleagues, my mentors, the people that have inspired me, stories of great discoveries, stories of how we know what we know, the tools we use, the new technologies we use to study fossils. And one of the stories I tell is of Zofia, who was a Polish scientist. She trained as an invertebrate paleontologist around the time of World War II. Actually, she was in Poland during the Warsaw Uprising. She put her studies, her undergraduate studies, on hold to be a medic during that horrible time, when hundreds of thousands of people in Warsaw were killed as the war was, kind of slowly coming to a close. But that was the era she grew up in. And then, of course, Poland became, a communist country, a satellite of the Soviet Union. But she was able, in that Cold War time, to make connections to other Soviet countries. And she had this dream of going into the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. She read these stories, these great adventure stories, Roy Chapman Andrews and the first explorers, Western explorers to go into the Gobi, using this new invention of the automobile to traverse the desert and finding all of these dinosaur eggs and nests and skeletons and so on. And, that was just very romantic to Zofia. But she was an invertebrate paleontologist. She studied like trilobites and stuff. And so she was persistent and she wanted to do it, and she pushed and she pushed, and she used the connections between Poland and Mongolia, which was a Soviet satellite at the time as well. And she organized these expeditions. There were several of them. They took place over about a decade in the 60s and 70s. And they were the first major female-led expeditions in the history of vertebrate paleontology.
Wow.
And these were big expeditions. I mean, they would go into the desert for, months and months on end. And what Zofia became really good at finding was dinosaurs. Her expedition, the fighting dinosaurs, the Velociraptor and the Protoceratops, found fossilized, locked in mortal combat. That's Zofia and, Polish Mongolian team discovered. Velociraptor, other Velociraptor skeletons, some, giant sauropods, lots of dinosaur eggs. But what Zofia really found lots of were mammals. Tiny mammals, because of course, this is the time of the dinosaurs. It's the Cretaceous. Mammals no bigger than house cats. And because mammals were so small during that time, they're very challenging to find. And Zofia found a way to find them. Mm-hmm. And she just developed an eye for this and started to discover site after site full of these tiny skulls and jaws and skeletons of mammals that people hadn't noticed before because they hadn't given that detailed look. And, they were hunting the trophy dinosaurs, the big dinosaurs, but she found a way. And then she studied these mammals and she became the world expert in mammals living during the time of dinosaurs. And she described species after species. And I was very fortunate to meet her when I was working in Poland. I worked in Poland when I was a master's student and a PhD student, really looking for Triassic aged fossils, stuff that was, we wanted to study the rise of dinosaurs. How did dinosaurs diversify after the end Permian extinction during this brave new world of the Triassic? So, we spent a lot of time in Poland, and on one of those trips, I had an opportunity, to go out to Zofia's house on the outskirts of Warsaw and spend an afternoon. And, her and her husband were just the most generous and warm hosts. They had a whole table full of cakes and sweets laid out for us. And, she regaled us with tales of her time in the Gobi. I was just like this starstruck, student just watching her, and just sitting there in a mouth agape. It's like, I don't know, meeting Mick Jagger or Michael Jordan or something. It was like that. And then, she took us into her study and showed us this room full of fossils, box after box of these mammal teeth and jaws and skulls from the Gobi Desert. She had her microscope out, and she's saying, "Oh, there's these ones are new. These ones still need to be worked on." This was in like around 2010, and so a good kind of 40 years after the last expedition, and she was still working. She was in her 80s, and she passed away a few years later. So I feel just incredibly fortunate to have been able to meet her after idolizing her for so long. And her legacy lives on, always will. One of the most inspiring paleontologists ever, but also just one of the best. All the fossils that she found, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I didn't realize she was the one that found the fighting dinosaurs. That's one of the coolest dinosaur discoveries ever.
Yep. And and they collected all kinds of stuff. They were looking for everything. They wanted to understand the entire ecosystems. And of course, many people still work in the Gobi today. It's a very rich area for fossils. And it was Zophia's work more than anybody that established the Gobi as this continuing place with rich fossils where there's a variety of sites, and you keep going there, keep finding new fossils.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing and for us being dinosaur people, sometimes we forget, like in those sites, like in the Gobi Desert, there's also a ton of mammals.
Yep.
Very easy to forget.
Yep, it is. And I have to remind myself, because I'm a dinosaur guy too. That's what what got me into paleontology was dinosaurs, like most people. And that's what I mostly studied early in my career. And, the more that I've studied dinosaurs, the more I've wondered, okay, well, what happened after the dinosaurs departed? What happened when it was only some birds left and the T-Rexes and the other giant dinosaurs were gone? And of course, what happened is mammals took over. So I become more and more fascinated with that story, our story, the story of our ancestors seizing the crown from the dinosaurs. And so, it's what interests me most, just kind of from a storytelling standpoint, but also from a research standpoint. So for about a decade now, I've been working in New Mexico, one of the best places in the world to find fossils of the very last dinosaurs and then the mammals that took over. And these are very well-dated sites. They're sites that have been worked on by Tom Williamson, my dear friend in New Mexico, who also studies dinosaurs. He's the guy who did the Parasaurolophus Sound. He's the guy who excavated Bistadi Verser, the Tyrannosaur. He's, kind of really well-known, world expert on Pachycephalosaurus. So he studies dinosaurs, but what he really does is study the Paleocene mammals that came after the dinosaurs. And for 25, 30 years now, he's been going out to these field sites a few hours from Albuquerque, where he's the curator at the museum, bringing his students out. A lot of Navajo students he's brought access to Navajo land, and more recently, me and my students. We're learning a lot about these mammals, and these are important mammals because, again, these are the ones that took over from the dinosaurs. They are the earliest placental mammals. They are our ancestors and closest cousins, and they tell us things like the origin of the type of pregnancies we have, something I know we've the three of us have been thinking a lot about recently with young kids. Like, it's just you ask why do we have babies that are raised in the womb for 9 months? It's because of these mammals surviving the asteroid, finding themselves in a dinosaur-free world, getting bigger. How do they get bigger? They prolong their pregnancy. So these are important mammals. They tell us about the roots of our own story, and that's what I love about them so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's making me excited about mammals. It's hard to do.
I'm a mammal evangelist. I'll always be a dinosaur evangelist, but I'm a mammal evangelist now too.
It makes sense. We're mammals, and see where things are going, and also studying the past helps us to kind of see where things are going now.
Absolutely, and these extinctions, we want to study them. Extinctions are these mass extinctions, so episodes where lots of things, are stressed in a very short amount of time because of some, big chaotic change to the system. What's going on today? Climates, environments are changing very quickly. So these mass extinctions and other extinction events in the fossil record, they're very important. They're the Earth has been through pretty much everything before. The Earth has gotten warmer before. It's just different causes than today. But, we want to look at fossils and see how do the animals respond? How do the ecosystems change? What lived, what died? And so there's a lot of about mammal evolution over the last 66 million years since the asteroid that is all in relation to climate, to changing climates. What do mammals do when temperatures spike? What do they do when temperatures get cool and the ice age comes in? So, that is another reason why mammals are so fascinating to study. They are clues from the past that tell us how real animals have changed during real episodes of climate and environmental upheaval.
Definitely. And also just because there's been so many types of mammals, it's kind of like with dinosaurs. You get such a wide range. Some are very weird, like platypus. And bringing it back to dinosaurs, one of the mammals you mentioned is Didelphodon.
Yes.
Which you said pound for pound more ferocious than T-Rex.
So Didelphodon was an absolutely terrifying animal. I mean, imagine something like a badger or a wolverine. Not to say it looked like that or it was the same size that, but just that general kind of a smallish mammal, but it's powerful, it's nasty, it's gnarly.
Yeah,
you don't want to run into what? It's the attitude. And so Didelphodon lived at the very end of the Cretaceous. It was there in the same ecosystems as T-Rex and Triceratops and duck-billed dinosaurs and, armored dinosaurs and so on. It would have been there when the asteroid hit. And it was fairly large. It was kind of getting close to cat size, but it had very sharp teeth and a really powerful bite, really powerful jaw muscles. How do we know? Well, you see the attachment sites for the muscles on the skull, and they're just enormous. And people like Greg Wilson and his team, University of Washington, they've built digital models of these skulls. They put them through biomechanical tests, and it shows these bite forces were off the chart. So pound for pound, these things were nastier, stronger biters than even the T-Rexes that were living with them. So, even during the time of dinosaurs, this is just to remind everybody and myself that, we shouldn't just treat these mammals as, second-class citizens. They were not. They were small. That's the only thing. They were small because the dinosaurs were keeping them small. But they were so diverse in those small niches. They were adapting and changing and developing these novel ways of feeding and moving. And we just don't appreciate it, I think, in part because they're small. And they're never going to be as grandiose as a T-Rex. But also, because they're small, it's just harder to find their fossils. I mean, we don't have, complete skeletons of these things. They're fragile. So if we had more of their fossils, I think people would appreciate them. Of course, after the dinosaurs, die at the asteroid, then when mammals get bigger in the Paleocene, you start to find more of their fossils. So you can just study them more and appreciate them more.
I do feel like the typical mammal fossil from the Mesozoic is like a partial jaw with the teeth sticking out of it.
Yeah. Or, half of a, second upper molar or something, and you're having to guess which cusps are these, but it's true. But what's also, just a remarkable story. And I tell this story in the book too, that when the first dinosaur was unveiled in kind of a modern Western scientific university context, this was when William Buckland announced Megalosaurus, back in England, in the early-ish 1800s. These giant bones were found out near Oxford, and they made their way to Buckland, who is this great, dean and theologian and natural scientist at Oxford. Crazy guy, by the way. I mean, a guy whose life ambition was to eat his way through the animal kingdom. He would throw dinner parties where he'd serve, meat from across the British Empire. He once is said to have eaten the pickled heart of one of the French kings. And I thought it was just a rumor, just some dumb tall tale. But I actually asked a historian who knows stuff. He said, no, like there's real, like verified written evidence from the time that this did happen, that he walked into this museum and asked to eat the heart. He had a pet bear in his house. He dressed the bear in academic robes, as one does. Anyway, but Buckley, the bones, these giant dinosaur bones, they weren't called dinosaurs at the time, but giant reptilian bones found their way to Buckland. He studied them. He announced them. He stood up at this meeting of learned individuals of that time, stood up at this meeting, announced that, yes, it's true, there are these bones of these giant reptilian creatures. I'm going to call it Megalosaurus. At the same meeting, he announced that they found some tiny fossils alongside the giant bones. These were little jaw bones, just about the size of like the jawbone of a shrew or a mouse. And they were mammal jaw bones because they had molar teeth, with all the complex cusps and valleys, like our teeth. So the day that Buckland announced the first dinosaur, he also announced the first fossils of mammals that lived with dinosaurs. And actually, for a while, those mammals, people really debated those things because this was crazy. Mammals go way back in time to an age of giant reptiles. But then over time, of course, the dinosaurs stole all the glory and took all the limelight. And the Mesozoic mammals, the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous mammals, could never have as much popularity because the fossils remained like that, just little jaws, little teeth. Maybe if you're lucky, a few parts of the vertebrae or ribs or a part of a leg or something, just incredibly rare. But it was Zofia in Mongolia that started to find the first really rich deposits of lots of skulls and skeletons of mammals that lived with dinosaurs. And then later on, about 25 years ago or so, very famously, the feathered dinosaurs were discovered in China. The beautiful feathers locked in because these ecosystems were buried by volcanoes. But these volcanoes locked in everything else too, almost Pompeii style. So there's plants and there's fishes and there's insects and there's pterosaurs and crocodiles and there's mammals and lots of mammals, beautiful skeletons, hair preserved, and then lots of them. And it's those Chinese fossils then that showed that there was this great diversity of mammals at small size in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. So it's really only been first with Zofia in the 60s and 70s in the Gobi Desert, then from the 90s onwards with farmers up in northeastern China discovering these mammal fossils with the feathered dinosaurs. There's only been then, there's even been decent fossil skeletons and entire skulls to study of mammals that lived during the age of dinosaurs. So this is really new. We're kind of, with those Mesozoic mammals, we're kind of at a stage of research, maybe equivalent to what dinosaurs were like during the bone wars of Marsh and Cope. So for young people out there listening, you want to be a paleontologist, you don't have to study dinosaurs. There's a lot more to learn about mammals, a lot more opportunity, a lot more mysteries that need to be solved.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Again, my pleasure.
For listeners, the book is The Rise and Reign of Mammals. And if you want kind of the prequel, can you call it the prequel? The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs?
Yes, it is. Certainly, as it was the book I wrote first. So in that sense, it's the prequel. But, they go together well. Great, gift set for the holidays. Right?
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again so much, Steve. I'm glad that we got to catch up at SVP and talk all about your book.
Yeah, those discussions are always fantastic. And I'm glad that there was so much dinosaur material, even in the book that was ostensibly about mammals.
Oh, but the mammal material was also awesome.
Yeah. And now we're going to pause for one more quick sponsor break. But when we get back, Sabrina is going to do our dinosaur of the day, which I don't think I can pronounce.
And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Bruhathkayosaurus, which was a request by Talon via our Patreon and Discord. So thanks. It was a Titanosaur sauropod, so we're wrapping up with sauropods, that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now India in the Kallamedu Formation. It probably looked like other sauropods, with a bulky body, a long neck, and long tail. The holotype was found in 1978, and that included hip bones, partial leg bones, part of the arm, and a tailbone. Now, the fossils from the Kallamedu Formation are not well preserved. You've got monsoon season, and with the sands and the clays from the formation that gets saturated with water, and then in the dry season, the fossils may expand in the day and contract at night, and that makes these fossils fragile.
Yeah, that does sound like a recipe for disaster.
Yes. Now, Bruhathkayosaurus was described by Yadagiri and Ayasami in 1987. However, according to Pal and Ayasami in 2022, so just a little earlier this year, the fossils started, quote, disintegrating in the field jackets and crumbled to dust before reaching the repository of the Geological Survey of India, Hyderabad, end quote.
That's a huge bummer.
Yes, these fossils, again, they're very, quote, friable in nature. And that's actually, that word friable, I hadn't heard much before, but we heard it a lot at SVP.
Mm-hmm.
The fossils, again, they're in the soft sandstone. They get water saturated during monsoon season, dry in the summer when it's so hot, and that contributes to the, quote, crumbly nature of the bones.
Yeah, and that's basically what friable means, is easily crumbled.
Yep. And so that means, we no longer have the holotype. And in that way, it's similar to Amphicoelius, which we covered very recently in episode 413.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
Yeah. Now, the original description had a few line drawings and photographs of the fossils at the dig site, but there are not many descriptions of its unique features. Some researchers thought the fossils were petrified wood because of the large size, and some people thought the find was a hoax.
Oh, geez.
It was originally thought to be a carnosaur theropod similar to Allosaurus, but then in 1995, Chatterjee reanalyzed the fossils and found Bruhathkayosaurus to be a titanosaur. Then later studies found it to be an indeterminate sauropod or nomum dubium. But again, that 2022 study that just came out, they reviewed the material and they found, yes, the skeleton was real and Bruhathkayosaurus was probably valid.
But they couldn't actually review the material. They could only review the
photos
pictures.
And there's drawings, yes.
That always makes it so much more difficult.
It does. They did talk about an additional photograph that hadn't been published before that shows the tibia bone of Bruhathkayosaurus in a plastered jacket. And that's the same tibia as the one in the other photos that showed it in the field. And that helps to show that, yes, this is real. This was not a hoax find.
Yeah. If that's all you're trying to prove is it wasn't a hoax, then yeah, that's a little easier than proving that it is a unique dinosaur.
They also said Bruhathkayosaurus is probably a sauropod based on the fossils having, quote, exceptionally large dimensions.
And that's usually a clue that it's a sauropod if it's enormous.
Blandford was the first to report large dinosaur bones from this formation in 1862. And then in 1929, Matley described some large bones and suggested they were from a titanosaur. Quote, this is from the 2022 study, although he was not able to extract any bones even with the greatest care, end quote. Again, they're very fragmentary.
And fragile.
Yes. Yadagiri and Ayasami found more large bones in 1987, and that's what they used to describe Bruhathkayosaurus. And more sauropod fossils were found in the same area, including a titanosaur egg. There's a lot of marine sediments in the formation, but there are some areas with vertebrate fossils, including dinosaurs. So there is evidence that there were sauropods in the area. That just helps the case with Bruhathkayosaurus. Back to its tibia, the tibia measurements show that it was gracile and similar to other sauropod tibia. The tibia was about 200 centimeters or about 78 inches long, and that's about 29% larger than the tibia of Argentinosaurus, which, as we know, is a very large dinosaur.
Yeah, that is big. 78 inches. What is that? That's like approaching 7 feet?
It's over 6 feet, right?
Yeah, like 6.5 feet.
Yeah.
That's massive.
Now, again, there are photos and diagrams of the ilium and tibia, but not of the other fossils found. The ilium was 120 centimeters, or about 47 inches long, and that's about 11 centimeters, or about 4 inches smaller than the ilium of Dreadnoughtus, another large dinosaur.
That's a good example of how you have to know which family it's in order to compare it properly.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you base it on the tibia and you say it's 29% larger than Argentinosaurus, it's like, holy cow, that's enormous. But then if you go based on that ilium and you say, well, it was a little bit smaller than Dreadnoughtus, all of a sudden it doesn't sound so impressive anymore.
Yes. The proportions of the ilium and tibia, though, they might mean they weren't from the same individual or even the same species.
That could be a problem.
And drawings of the ilium bone also show a feature that's found in theropod dinosaurs, which is probably why there was that confusion earlier. Now, based on an illustration in the 2022 paper, which that illustration is based on the tibia bone, Bruhathkayosaurus is estimated to be roughly about 100 feet or 30 meters long. And that's a little bit bigger than a blue whale, which is amazing. We always talk about blue whales being the largest animals ever.
I mean, yes, I like to think of largest by weight rather than length.
Oh, I see.
Because a long, skinny sauropod tail compared to the massive, like, diameter of a blue whale torso or body, like, aren't really comparable. So a blue whale definitely weighed more. But yeah, there were definitely sauropods that were longer than blue whales.
Mm-hmm. The type species is Bruhathkayosaurus matlii. The genus name means huge-bodied lizard, which seems apt. And it comes from the Sanskrit word Bruhathkaya, which means huge body. The species name matlii is in honor of Charles Alfred Matley, a paleontologist who found many fossils in India. And other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include abelosaurids, carnosaurs, sauropods, stegosaurs, and troodontids.
And our fun fact of the day came from a talk at SVP that I really enjoyed. It was by Armita Manafeda, and she was looking, as she usually does, at how dinosaur joints function. There have been all sorts of amazing talks over the years of her. I think they include things like slow motion guinea fowl feet. I'm pretty sure that was her. Basically just reconstructing how dinosaurs would have moved. The really interesting thing about this talk is that basically what she said was, my previous talks were all wrong. Looking at joints moving in 3 dimensions is not good enough. You actually need 6 dimensions in order to correctly describe how dinosaur joints would have moved.
Wow.
So when I say 6 dimensions, it sounds crazy because we know that real world space has 3 dimensions, or 4 if you want to include time. Some people do that. But really what we should call it is degrees of freedom, because all the movements are in 3D space. So it's still in 3-dimensional space. It's just 6 different movements you can think of. So basically, if you're thinking about the joint, it's sort of like, is the joint moving along the axis that you would expect it to bend? Is it twisting a little bit from side to side? Or is it sort of hinging from side to side? So it's sort of like twisting, bending one way or bending the other way are the 3 dimensions that we usually talk about when we're talking about joints. But in this case, they added 3 more dimensions, which they refer to as translations. And those, rather than being rotation, side to side, up, down, twisting, they're the bones moving away from the joints. So sort of like being pulled away in different directions. And that happens naturally when animals move their joints. They don't stay fixed like permanently. It's not a hinge in your joint. There's cartilage in between it and ligaments and things, and they can pull away a little bit and they can get into different shapes that you wouldn't normally expect. So just by looking at the bones really simply. When they included those extra degrees of freedom into the analysis, they basically ended up with less clarity on it. And the way she put it was, you need to embrace the loss of clarity. That basically our paradigms weren't as accurate as we thought. But then it was really clever. She tried to quantify why some bone interactions look right or look wrong. And what she found was that it's easier to find out when joints look wrong. And basically what she ended up doing was modeling how these bones move. She still didn't have to include tissues like cartilage, which is really useful because models that require you to guess what the cartilage is like is obviously very fraught when you talk about dinosaurs, because it never preserves.
Such high variation there.
Exactly. And so you don't really want to rely on that. Instead, she ended up with a basically statistical model of the most likely positions of where these joints would be. And the models and the results aren't finalized yet, but when you put it together, we could potentially look at things like how far sauropods could bend their necks from side to side, or how much ankylosaurs could move their tails, or details about how all these dinosaurs walked and how much their feet would change, like the individual toe joints and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of possibilities that you can do because you can model any joint you want. You don't have to figure out the cartilage. You can just put it into a very complicated model with 6 degrees of freedom.
Think of the animations.
Yeah, exactly. So she showed a couple of like very early results of what it might look like, but it's still early phases because I think she recently was working on a new study and was going to put it into the old model and then realized, oh no, that model's not what I want. So I thought it was an excellent example of, she's been working in this paradigm of 3 dimensions, 3 different rotations for all this time, and then realized, no, wait, I need to rethink this, and ended up with a better model, which will be a lot more useful in the future and more correct.
Cool. And on that note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed all the SVP updates from this year so far. And now is a good time, if you haven't yet joined our community of fellow Dino-know-it-alls, you can get access to that sweet, sweet bonus content that we keep talking about. That is if you join at patreon.com/iknowdino. Thanks again, and until next time.